Поймал кто-нибудь меня на это? Если поймали, почему не сказали? Совершенно напрасно. И, можно сказать, проснулся этой ночью, потому что же это я людям написала. Пожалуйста, если заметите на доске что-то написано, говорите сразу. Я как постаралась очистить свет.
Сейчас я проверю только.
Конечно же. Так. Пожалуйста, раздайте хронологии, себе пока оставьте одну. Так, вот прошу. Так, теперь дальше. Пожалуйста, списки лексики. В основном ради списка имен собственных. Пожалуйста, по этому списку послеживайте понемножку, потому что имен в этой лекции будет очень много. Так, то же самое, пожалуйста. Это лексика, разнесенная по темам. Так, и давайте сразу, чтобы потом не терять на это времени, я раздам вам список лексики по следующей лекции, по 5-й. Пока просто отложите это в сторонку. Так. То сейчас у каждой пары должно быть 4 листочка. Так, да? Так, скажите, пожалуйста, у всех есть bell на парте, хотя бы один? Great. Ага. Окей. Все в порядке, да? Ага, если дотянусь. Так, и последнее. Так, пожалуйста, вот в этот список себя внесите. Пометьте просто присутствие на сегодняшней лекции. Поставьте, пожалуйста, там число где-нибудь сверху, ладно? Сверху или наоборот внизу. Давайте внизу вот там вот. И пускай каждый против себя поставит крестик. Ага, спасибо. Well, I'm glad to see those of you who survived through ancient Britain, Roman Britain, and part of Anglo-Saxon Britain. Today we shall talk about Anglo-Saxon Britain, because it hasn't yet come to end. We'll invade Britain again for the, difficult to say which time. We'll invade Britain with the Normans, and we'll stay for a while in the Norman Britain with them as conquerors. Last time we stopped somewhere at the end of 9th century. We were talking about King Alfred, if you remember that. From now on, as Britain is more and more unified and the power is more and more centralized in the hands of one person, that is of the monarch, the personal character of this monarch will be more and more important for us. So it's my personal opinion, but I think that the closer to our times, the more the history of Britain depends on the personal character, on the features of the monarch's nature. So from now on I shall be saying at least a few words about each king or queen of Britain. As to King Alfred, so far we know about him quite a little. One thing we know for sure, that he came to the throne in 871, that he was fighting the Danes. Once he fought like a wild boar, which is dikkie vepr, but soon he was defeated and was hiding in the marshes, where he wasn't good enough to look after the cakes, and the cakes burnt. That's the only thing that we know about him for sure. Well, some more things. As I told you, he managed to persuade one of the Danish leaders, whose name was Guthrun, to become a Christian. Guthrun was baptized as Athelstan, and of course it made it easier for Alfred to discuss political and other matters, not with a Danish enemy, but with a friend and a Christian. So Alfred persuaded the Danes to keep in certain borders. I told you last time about Watling Street. Remember that? One of the former Roman roads leading from London to the north. So this Watling Street and the Roman road became the border of the territory which is called Danelaw. Who remembers the Russian equivalent? The Danelaw. Область датского права. That is the territory where the Danes were ruling by their own laws. As you remember, law is also a Danish word, just as window, leg, sister, happy, low, ugly, and many others. Here is the picture, the map of England of that time, the end of 9th and the beginning of the 10th century. Here it is. As I told you, there was a time when Wessex was the only English kingdom free from the Danes, and Alfred was the king of Wessex. So Wessex is still free. Wales was never annexed by the Danes, annexирован, захвачен. Maybe because Celts were still living there and Celts were rather unbending. And this here was called Danelaw, область датского права, to the north of Watling Street, к северу от Watling Street. And while keeping this treaty, договор, with the Danes, Alfred was preparing a system of defense that would work even when his friend Athelstan, former Gudrun, will die. Here it is. Have a better look at it. Please tell me, who has read the chapter from Bell's book, which I asked you to read, about Alfred's system of defense? Some of you have, thanks. That's good. I won't speak in much detail about that. For those who has read it, it will be easier to remember things. For those who hadn't, well, there's always room for development, which means всегда есть куда развиваться, и вот всегда есть некий потолок, которого можно достигать. As to Alfred's system of defense, first, he insisted that all his subjects, подданные, served for some time in his army. It was something like воинская повинность. But being a wise man, he didn't insist upon all the people coming at once. Half of those, how to put it, military obligated, как бы военно обязанных, half of them were serving, the other half was back home, cultivating lands, building, just doing normal everyday work. Alfred organized cavalry consisting of his knights. What's cavalry? And the knights should come with their own horses, good horses, their own weapons, and a little, well, team or group of their people, usually archers, обычно стрелков. And the peasants formed the infantry. What is infantry? Пехота, cavalry and infantry. Also, Alfred paid great attention to the fleet. Alfred the Great, fleet or navy. Alfred the Great was the first man, historically, politically at least, who understood that England's or Britain's position on the islands, apart from many disadvantages, недостатков, had a lot of advantages, that is, преимуществ. I think you remember, waves of immigrants and invaders were coming to Britain across the channel, using their boats. So each nation which had good boats or good ships under sails, парусные, could come to Britain and invade it. taking it by surprise. Застигнув врасплох. Alfred decided to use the advantage of this position, or the fact that Britain is surrounded by water from every side. So he was building fleet. And by the way, his ships were longer and larger than those of the Danes. And I showed you the picture of a Danish ship, didn't I? Remember, 75 feet long and 15 feet wide. So Alfred's ships were bigger, even bigger than that. While he was organizing infantry and cavalry, while he was building the fleet, he also was building on the land. The place is called boroughs. Boroughs, no. Well, in one book I saw a word, a Russian equivalent, посад. Well, of course it's not exactly that, but boroughs are maintained, not cities, but settlements. Такие вот укрепленные, военизированные поселения. Ну, собственно, военные городки. I think I write the word borough, or is it in your list of words? It is there, so I won't write it. Good, borough. And I think that it's clear that such places as Scarborough, something else, are from these boroughs. At first, these are just military settlements. Those who have read the bells remember that each borough was surrounded by a ditch. What's a ditch? Roof. In everyday life it is just kanava, but of course in military affairs it is roof. There were barracks, that is places where soldiers could live, казармы. Of course there were churches, and in each borough there was a priest praying for military success. And Alfred made the thanes, так называемых танов, the big landowners, usually of noble origin, благородного происхождения, he made him support his boroughs. There were not only soldiers who came to serve for some time and then were replaced by others. The thanes, I think I'll write this word because I'm not sure it's there, thanes. A thane, a big landowner, big, rich in men and lands. The thanes were made by Alfred to give cattle, food, weapons, so the soldiers in these boroughs always had good supply of water, food, weapons, well, wood to make fire, all the things they needed. And well, the purpose of these boroughs was similar to that of the Latins, with their military camps, castras. These were places where there were always soldiers ready to defend the country. So during Alfred's reign, no Danish people, no Vikings, apart from those who have settled already, could take England by surprise. There were always soldiers ready to defend their country. The soldiers there were, the soldiers were trained, they were having a real military service. Настоящая такая вот военная служба. They were trained, they were drilled, they were ready to do their duty. These boroughs were at Rochester, Exeter, Chichester, and by the way, one of these boroughs was at Hastings, on the place where then the town of Hastings grew. So much for Alfred as the ruler, well, as the warrior and the defender of his country. But if you look into your list of words, you will see that just after the name of Alfred, there is a list of words that could be applied to him. What's a lawgiver? Законодатель, right you are. So, as a lawgiver, Alfred took great pains to collect and put in order all the laws that existed in his time. He put them into one code. Of course, in this code was made in the interests of big landowners and the nobles. It was called the Code of English Law, кодекс английского закона или английских законов. And one of the central idea of this code was to love one's lord as oneself. That is, that a person should love his authority as himself or more than himself. Alfred, of course, to support, to maintain these laws, Alfred needed a number of officials, официальных лиц. And he insisted that all his officials, all the judges, just судьи, were learned people. So he wanted his assistants to be educated. Then, some words should be said about Alfred as a scholar. The word scholar, I think, is familiar to you. He was a very educated man himself. He knew Latin and Greek. He was reading in Latin and Greek, and he was one of the first English translators. He was translating himself and also patronizing other translators. Remember that by Alfred's time, most of, well, strictly speaking, all of the literature, ecclesiastical, that is церковная, philosophical, and even on mathematics, well, meteorology, all these books were written in Latin, mostly. Venerable Bede wrote his the ecclesiastical history of the Angles in Latin. So only monks could read it, only people who knew Latin themselves. Alfred was the first to translate the ecclesiastical story of the Angles, written by Venerable Bede, вот ту самую церковную историю англов. As I already told you, he was also patronizing other translators. Next, he rebuilt the schools, which were monastery schools, which were destroyed during the Danish raids. He rebuilt schools, and he was also founding new schools. And by the way, it was he who founded, organized one of the first non-ecclesiastical schools, so to say, mundane, светскую школу. It was organized for his own children and their friends, that is, the children of his supporters, of his court. Для детей собственных и своих сторонников. And what is rather interesting, Alfred was teaching himself at that school. They were studying Latin, of course, mathematics, theology, maybe some philosophy. Also, Alfred sent to the continent for famous builders, artisans, which is not exactly craftsmen, не ремесленники, а вот скорее прикладные художники, and scholars to teach his people. By the way, in the boroughs, the priests were instructed to pray, to preach in English, not in Latin, so that the soldiers could understand what the prayer was about. If we must characterize Alfred just in 2 or 3 words, I would say, using some words from your list, that he was learned or educated, humane. Remember the difference between human, which means just a man, and humane, which is гуманный. He was rather merciful for a king, but firm. That didn't mean that his willpower was weak. He was rather a firm man. I'd like you to answer one question, remembering all Alfred's deeds and traits of character. So, a military man, a ruler, a lawgiver, a scholar, a teacher to some extent, a translator, a patron of arts and sciences. Which figure in Russian history does he remind you of? Sure. I think that it's the association which is inevitable, неизбежно. Sometimes, as soon as I mention his interest in building the fleet, somebody says, yes, just like Peter the Great. Quite true. As you remember, Peter was organizing schools. He insisted on not only the children of the nobles, but the nobles themselves getting some education. So the figure is quite similar to Peter the Great, only I should say Alfred's reign was less bloody than Peter's. What's bloody? Well, I think it's because there was an external enemy, serious enough not to spill so much blood inside the country. But it's only my idea of why Alfred was more merciful than Peter. It was in Alfred's time that the book called Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was begun. Just as Alfred ordered to collect all the laws and organize them into the Code of English Law, he ordered the monks to try and collect all the facts known from the history of England. Of course, he was using the ecclesiastical history of the Angles by Venerable Bede, and he ordered that all important events of the years to come were recorded into this book. So in his time, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that's the name, так и называется, англосаксонская хроника, was begun, and it was being kept for 250 years. That is for 2 centuries and a half. Now it is translated into modern English. It was written in Anglo-Saxon English, which is also called Old English, староанглийский. Remember, Shakespeare was writing in the Middle English. Now we are speaking the modern English. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is translated, and in the library, well, for example, of the British Council, there is that book. The paper is rather thin. There are about, I don't remember for sure, 600 or 700 pages. It's like that. The letters are rather small, and well, it's difficult to believe that it is the very book that was being written for 200 years and 50. But still it is. And some of the facts I'm telling you are taken from there. Well, oh yes, now the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as well as Bede's ecclesiastical history is in the British Museum. After Alfred, so Alfred fulfilled King Arthur's dream about uniting England. After Alfred, his successors, what are successors? Последователи, те, кто за ним следует, to succeed, следовать за кем-то, his successors were good enough to maintain the peace and the unity of Britain, which we now, I think, still should call England. He had 2 children, and I think that you should look into your list of names, so it is easier for you to follow the story. His children's names were Edward the Elder, Edward Starszy, and he had also the daughter Ethelfleda or Ethelfleda, difficult to say now. Ethelfleda was the wife of the king of Mercia, whose name was Ethelred. And after his death, she ruled the country, and the Mercians, Merciцы, called her Our Lady of Mercia, which is well, a title of honor. Alfred's children, being his political successors, did their best to keep the Danes where they were, that is, in the boundaries of Dane law, области датского права. Has everybody seen the map? Все карты уже видели, да? Girls, have you seen it? Will you please pass it on to the ladies who are in isolation, for them to have a look at it. After Edward the Elder, who ruled from 899, that's the year of Alfred's death, to 924. I don't think that you should write all the dates because there will be a lot of dates. Just try to catch the main idea. 3 of his sons ruled. Don't write all the dates. The first was Athelstan, who ruled from 924 to 940. Then came Edmund, 940-946. Then Edred, 946-955. I'll switch on to Russian for a minute. Мой вам совет. Я могу повторить все эти даты. Вот правление 3 сыновей сына короля Альфреда. Но это, в общем-то, не так важно. Важно то, чтобы вы заметили, что правили они один за другим. Правил Альфред, правил его сын, правили 3 его сына. Линия не прерывалась. Политика сохранялась одна и та же. И какое-то время не было правителей со стороны. Никто вот в это фамильное древо не вторгался. After Edward, the third son of Edward the Elder, 2 Edmund's sons ruled. The first of them was Edwy, and he ruled from 955 to 959. And then Edgar the Peaceable. This name I think you should write down. Edgar the Peaceable, Edgar Миротворец, who ruled from 959 to 975. So you see, Alfred's family was on the throne for quite a long time. Alfred, you see these Edgars, Edwards, Edwys, they're getting terribly confused. Have you read the little passage about egg kings? Читали, да? Well, of course they were not egg kings, but this idea with Edward, Edgar, Edwy, it makes studying this period rather difficult. What is important for us is that since Alfred the Great came to the throne in 871, for a century, that is till 975, his son, his 3 grandsons, and his 2 great-grandsons, the last of whom was Edgar the Peaceable, were on the throne of England and were keeping the Danes more or less in control. Edgar the Peaceable had the title the King of England. Who had this title before? Do you remember? Offa. Do you remember King Offa, who was ruling 6 of 7 kingdoms? Edgar the Peaceable was accepted as the king of the English both by the Saxons and the Danes. So even the Danes admitted him as the overlord, как верховного властителя. He was also the overlord of the kings of Scotland and Wales. So the power over Britain was more and more centralized in hands of Alfred the Great's great-grandson, правнука. And this period is called the later flowering, расцвет, of Anglo-Saxon culture. One of the most important figures of Anglo-Saxon culture of that period is a person whose name is St. Dunstan. Святой Дунстан. Well, as I told you, St. Hilda, St. Theodore, at first they were just Hilda, Theodore, Augustine, Patrick, David. After some heroic deeds, they were called saints. So St. Dunstan was a personal friend of Edgar the Peaceable. Как вы помните, вообще вот личная дружба с королями всегда святым очень помогала. Святому Августину повезло, что он был дружен с королем Этельбертом. Иначе вряд ли бы он окрестил 10 тысяч британцев чуть ли не в один день. So St. Dunstan was a scholar, a musician, and he was famous for his bells and organs. He was a specialist in making bells and organs, and a great specialist, I think, in church music. In 960, St. Dunstan became the Archbishop of Canterbury. But after Edgar the Peaceable, that is at the end of the 10th century, the late flowering of Anglo-Saxon culture came to an end, because Edgar's successor or successors were rather ill-suited, не очень подходили, to keep England united as it was. Well, Alfred's and King Arthur's dream about England as one country came to end with the sons of Edgar the Peaceable. The first of them was Edward the Martyr. Will you find him in the list? What's the Russian for martyr? Мученик. Вот это вы, по-моему, немножко задремываете. Как раз подходим к самому бурному периоду. Edward the Martyr was a king, was supposed to be a king only for 4 years, from 975 to 979. At the age of 4, he was stabbed to death, which is заколот. To stab, that is заколоть кинжалом. He was stabbed to death maybe by the supporters of his brother. Please tell me, which figure in Russian history does it remind you of? A child, the pretendant to the throne, killed in his childhood. А? Ну, вспомните, ребенок, вот ближайший претендент на трон, собственно, таких примеров было много. Тоже оставшийся в памяти как мученик. А Иван Антонович, конечно же, но еще моложе, поэтому еще как-то вот более жутко. Да царевич Дмитрий же, кстати. So, both in Russian and in English history there are some children who were the victims of their birth. Такие вот заложники собственного рождения. Being too close to the throne, they were stabbed to death, they were killed in the tower, like the princess, by Richard III. They were just put to some distant prison, where they died nobody knows when. After Edward the Martyr, the 4-year-old boy, killed, King Ethelred came to the throne. In the history, he is known under at least 3 nicknames, прозвища. And by the way, the nicknames will be rather important for us. Собственно, ведь Alfred the Great is also a nickname, прозвище. So the nicknames of Ethelred, the most famous of them is the unready. What's the Russian for the unready? Не готовый. He had 2 other nicknames. One of them was ill-advised. How could you translate that? Ethelred, the ill-advised. Тот, которому плохо советовали. Remember, ill-mannered is a person with bad manners. Ill sometimes means bad or badly. So his names were Ethelred the Unready, the one mentioned in the list, or Ethelred the ill-advised, тот, у которого были плохие советчики, or Ethelred readyless. It's an old English word. Readyless. But the suffix less is here, meaning absence of some quality, отсутствие качества. Readyless, that is, he who lacked the advice, тот, которому не хватало советов. So some historians think that his advisors were just bad people. Some think that there was nobody around to give him good advice. Well, the reason why he was called the Unready is rather simple. After the death of Edgar the Peaceable, the Danes became more aggressive, feeling that whether the king's hand is not so strong as it was, that the king's power is weakening, ослабевает. And though Ethelred the Unready was crowned at Canterbury by St. Dunstan at the age of 10, it didn't do him much good. Ему это пошло на пользу. He was never ready for the Danish raids, which renewed. And he did a very unwise thing, I should say a silly thing. The Danes suggested that if they are paid some certain sum of money, they won't come again. And Ethelred, being ill-advised, agreed to that. Now just imagine the situation. Well, for example, we are sitting here doing some serious business. Somebody comes, some nasty person, well, I don't know, with clubs or fists or something, begins shouting at us and threatening us. Just like that, but more aggressive. And instead of gathering together and making them out of this classroom by strength, if they are not, if it's not possible to persuade them, we just say to them, okay, Keep quiet, people, we'll pay you. We collect the money, all of us give all that we have and give it to them, saying, but please, please don't come anymore. Of course, in 5 minutes they will come back, asking for more money. I think psychologically the situation is quite clear. That's exactly what happened in England. Being paid once, of course, the Danes, who always needed money, especially those who were still sailing, the Vikings, not the settlers, they came again and again. The sum of money was bigger and bigger. And Ethelred became very unpopular among the English, that is the Saxons, for paying the Danes, because of course the money was taken from the people. That's why Ethelred the Unready was one of the most unpopular English kings. And the money that he was paying them to keep peace was called Danegeld. I think you have heard or seen the word once or maybe many times. Danegeld. Какое слово здесь явно просматривается? Конечно же, конечно. Датское золото, датские деньги. So you should remember these two historical terms: Danelaw, область датского права, Danegeld, датские деньги. And what the English thought and think now about this period is very well expressed by Rudyard Kipling. Do you remember I read to you the poem The Centurion's Song, the Pict's Song? And now, if you don't mind, I'll read you a little poem which is called just Danegeld, expressing Kipling's feelings on that. And I think that the feelings of most of British people at that time was just alike. Okay? I'll read it to you in Russian. But if anybody of you is interested, well, the text in English is available. So, Дань Дании. Appreciate that alliteration. Вообще аллитерацию оцените, перевод ее очень неплохо передает. And the date of this poem is from 980, примерно с 980 по 1016. Соблазнительно для нации скорой на руку формации прийти с мечом к соседу и сказать: вы уже окружены, вложим мы мечи в ножны, если вы согласны, откуп дать. И это зовется дань Дании. Захватчик дает вам понять, что если получит дань Дании, то армия двинется вспять. Соблазнительно для нации, обленившейся формации, мошну свою похлопать и сказать: мы могли бы и сразиться, только некогда возиться, мы предпочитаем откуп дать. И это зовется дань Дании. Но право, пора и понять, что стоит хоть раз дать дань Дании, захватчик ворвется опять. Отвратительно для нации перспектива оккупации. Но если придется выбирать, откупиться ли деньгами или в бой вступить с врагами, будет лучше прямо им сказать. Отродясь не платили дань Дании. Да и дело совсем не в деньгах. Ведь такой договор – это стыд и позор. И для нации гибель и крах. Well, I trust Rudyard Kipling in that. I think it's just what the British people of that period, just how they felt about Danegeld. So, when Ethelred the Unready died in 1016, the date from the poem, he was not mourned very much. To be mourned, быть оплакиваемым. Не очень, видимо, по нему печалились. His son became the king, his son by the name of Edmund Ironside. As to this name Ironside, I've never seen it in Russian translation. Well, I could translate it as железнобокий, что-нибудь в этом роде. Edmund the Ironside. Almost nothing is known about this king because he stayed on the throne for less than 1 year. Because in 1016, of course it's not so important a date as 1066, but still, in 1016, a Scandinavian ruler, let us call him a Dane, by the name of Canute, came to Britain, defeated Edmund the Ironside, and became the king of Britain, thus инкорпорируя, то есть включая в состав, incorporating Britain into the Yes, into the Scandinavian Empire. At that time, Scandinavian Empire consisted of Denmark, Norway, and thanks to Canute, Britain became part of it. So for a while, Britain was a Scandinavian country, strange as it might seem. Sorry, вам не дует? Нормально, да? Если кому-то будет дуть, скажите, пожалуйста. Well, another. Oh yes, speaking about Canute, the name is also there, and in the chronology of the kings, here it is, the house of Skjoldings. I'm not very sure about my Danish. I think it is pronounced this way. So here are the Scandinavian kings of Britain. Sometimes this king is called Knut, sometimes Canute, but the stress is on the last syllable. В любом случае, ударение на последнем слоге. It might seem strange, but after Edmund the Ironside, whom his people hardly had any time to know at all, after Ethelred the Unready, Canute was rather popular among the British. Which is strange, isn't it? An invader, a foreigner. He made some very wise, politically wise steps. First, he married Ethelred's widow. I think you can imagine the position of a widow in the Middle Ages. As soon as the husband dies, the woman, well, strictly speaking, is not existing anymore. It's not life, it's just surviving. Of course, the king's widow is in a very bad position. She doesn't have any power. Usually she doesn't have almost any money. So marrying Ethelred's widow, Canute did a very wise thing. The English people appreciated this gesture, оценили. Then, very soon, Canute was baptized and became a Christian, which was also quite wise of them in a Christian country. Besides that, he was, well, he appointed a lot of the Saxons to the highest posts in the country. В основном на высокие посты назначал саксов. Also, he used to send some British priests back to Scandinavia to convert his subjects there. So he was a sort of a defender of Christianity, defender and popularizer. But of course, he still took Danegeld, only he was not taking it from some other king, he was just collecting Danegeld as a tax to support his fleet. He came to Britain with a fleet and uniting it, объединив, with a fleet built by Edward the Great. He was, well, quite an important ruler. He was ruling Britain from 1016 to 1042. Sorry, I'm afraid I made a little mistake. To 1035. After that, there were two of his sons. One of them was called Harthacnut, and the second was called Harold Harefoot. Гарольд Зайчья нога. Вы знаете, да, что такое зайчья нога? Вот я никогда не уверена, это два сросшихся пальца или наоборот, как бы один палец раздвоенный. По-моему, два сросшихся. Ну, вот, в общем, какой-то такой дефект пальцев. So that's the nickname of one of Canute's sons. These two kings, Harthacnut and Harold Harefoot, were ruling in turns, по очереди, from 1035 to 1042. If I'm not mistaken, one of them, just a minute, one of them was ruling from his father's death to 1040, then the other came to the throne for 2 years, then he was replaced again by his brother. But I don't think it matters very much for us. And after these two sons of Canute, another Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, came to the throne. But before we talk about the last of Saxon kings, and strictly speaking the last of English kings of that period, I would like you to read a very small part from the books that you already know, 1066, dedicated to Canute. And I think to Ethelred also. Will you? Take it. Так, вот это, я боюсь, придется даже одну на троих, вот что-нибудь в этом роде. Will you distribute the text? Sorry, 1 for 3. I warn you once again, please remember, it's not serious. It's a joke history. Don't take it too serious. We're just summarizing what I have told you about Ethelred and Ready. Who will please read? Who will begin reading? Так, пожалуйста, придумайте что-нибудь, подсядьте кому-то, вот, увы. С текстами у нас явные проблемы. Ну что ж. Так, пожалуйста. Ну вот очень долго сейчас будем опять ждать волонтеров, да? Очень не хочется во взрослых, очаровательных дам тыкать пальцем. Girls, sorry. Will you, any of you, but quickly. Пожалуйста. Ну, вперед. Ну, что такое?
Непонятно.
Ну, по-моему, стерто только одно слово was. Any problems?
Ну, давайте почитать, что
Так, ну поехали, заголовок. Ага. Ага, thank you. You will continue. Now, will you please?
Ethelred the Unready was the first weak king of England and was thus the cause of a fresh wave of kings.
Thank you. And will you translate just here on the spot?
Ethelred не готовый первым хилым, слабым королем Англии и
What does it mean, thus? Таким образом.
И таким образом причина
Послужил причиной, стал причиной
новой волны
датчан. Видите слова wave и wig с большой буквы. Первым слабым королем, из-за него новая волна датчан прокатилась по Англии. Thanks a lot. Well, will you continue, ladies? Any of you?
He was called the Unready because he was never ready when the Danes were. Rather than wait for him, Danes used to find him large sums called Dengel for not being ready.
Thank you. Will you stop here and translate?
Он назывался не готовым, потому что он никогда не был готов к тому, что когда придет Дэнни.
Почти. Он никогда не был готов, когда датчане уже были готовы. Вот они готовы были вторгнуться, а он все еще нет. Дальше. Rather than. Instead of. Вместо того, чтобы.
Вместо того, чтобы ждать.
Подождать его. Ну, пока он тоже приготовится.
Датчане платили ему большие...
Стоп. Сказать, что датчане что-то платили английскому королю, может только тот, кто здесь не был в последний час.
Получали?
Конечно. Что такое to fine? Штраф, конечно же. Датчане вот имели обыкновение налагать на него штраф. В виде штрафа требовать с него большие суммы.
Которые назывались...
Либо дани, либо датские деньги. За что? За то, что не был готов. Все вполне по-спортивному. Thanks a lot. Who will continue? Ну, пожалуйста, давайте кто-нибудь.
But though they were always ready, the Danes had very bad memories and often used to forget that they had been paid their Dengeld and come back for it almost before they had sailed away. By that time, Ethelred was already again.
Will you translate?
Но несмотря на то, что
Они-то всегда были готовы, ага. Вот какой у датчан был недостаток?
Датчане имели очень плохой.
Да, память у них была коротка. Угу.
Забывали, что налог был уплачен.
Что им уже заплатили, ага. И
возвращались обратно, чтобы получить очередную дань.
Before they sailed away. Just a minute. И возвращались, еще не успев отплыть. К этому времени was always unready again. Опять был к этому не готов. Спасибо. То есть, согласитесь, никаких противоречий вот, в общем, нету. Все действительно, ну, так, как я вам рассказывала, чистая правда. Ну, немножко в таком спортивном ключе. Они были готовы, а он нет. Он им платил, но они как-то об этом все время забывали и все время возвращались обратно, чтобы получить то, что им, по их представлениям, не додали. The last sentence, who will read it? Well, will you please? Sorry, I don't know your name. Will you?
Finally, Operator was taken completely unawares by his own death and was succeeded by Canning.
Could you translate that?
В конце концов,
Ethelred? Что такое to be taken unaware? That is to be taken by surprise. Ага, Этельреда застала врасплох? Ага. Совершенно верно. В результате чего? Его сменил канут. Только как будущим преподавателем должна вам сказать, что когда человек говорит нагнувшись, то весь голос уходит туда, в стол. Вот и получается как в театре, как из суфлерской будки. Мне слышно, тогда больше никому. Погромче. Спасибо. Уф. Так, а следующее мы сделаем такое. Пожалуйста, посмотрите. По тексту вот здесь вот излагается версия авторов этого шуточного учебника касательно сыновей Канута. Я переведу, вас попрошу просто последить по тексту. Идет? Итак, Канут – король-экспериментатор. Ну, здесь выпущен небольшой кусочек. Речь идет о том, что Канут пытался вот to sit on the water without being wet. Как бы сидеть на воде, при этом не промокая. Но речь, конечно, идет о его власти как, ну, как морской державы, как короля морской державы. Но дело-то не в этом. Этот легко запоминающийся монарх, отправившись однажды из Норвегии, чтобы собрать некоторое количество датских денег, случайно приземлился на случайно, как это называется, высадился на острове Танат и таким образом стал королем. Если помните, не он первый высадился на острове Танат, практически все завоеватели высаживались именно там. Вот это самое лучшее место для высадки, которого не обнаружил Цезарь. У Канута было двое сыновей. Вот кто попробует перевести имена? Вот по версии этих учебников. Half a Canute, part a Canute. Полуканут и отчасти Канут. И еще два отпрыска, которых звали rather Canute и hardly Canute. Вполне Канут и едва ли Канут, совершенно верно. Которых, однако, он так и не признал, до конца отрицая, что он был их father Canute, что он им доводился папой Канутом. Уф. Put it aside, please. Отложите, пожалуйста. И постарайтесь, приблизительно хотя бы запомнить, что вот Канутов там было несколько. И один из них был заячьей ногой. Well, but as I told you, after this rather short period of Scandinavian rule over Britain, Britain being part of Scandinavia, Edward the Confessor became the king of Britain, the last Anglo-Saxon king, the last English king. As history says, he was very unhandsome as a man. He had white skin and white hair, такой вот белесый, со светлой кожей, светлыми волосами, very weak-willed, слабовольный, and very pious. The word pious means благочестивый. He was Ethelred the Unready's second son. So he was waiting for some years to come to the throne, and at last he did that. he began the construction of Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey was begun during the reign of Edward the Confessor. And his main pleasures, his main joys in life were hunting, praying, and church building. He was equally fond of hunting and praying. Whenever he was not hunting, he was in the church. That's why he was called the Confessor. And as it is said in the book 1066, just their version, he was called the Confessor because he was always trying to confess everything that he has done and that everybody else has done. And it was very difficult to make him not to confess in all the crimes committed in his reign. Пытался признаться во всем, что вот совершил он, а также все вокруг него. Well, as a political figure, he was rather weak, not as weak as Ethelred the Unready, but he's told to do what he was told by his nobles and by his son as well. And not even after his death, but while he was dying, well, an event happened that frightened the English people a lot. If you open the Bell's book on page, just a minute, on page 70, yes, page 70, you will see the picture of Edward the Confessor, of course with not much personal resemblance. You will see Westminster Abbey as it looked 70 and 71. Westminster Abbey as it looked when it was only begun to be built. And if you turn the page, on page 72, you will see, just a minute, sorry, on page 74, excuse me, you will see the picture of the event I was telling you about. Конечно. Я ведь спросила, у кого нету книжки, кому она нужна, пожалуйста. In 1066, a comet appeared in the sky of Britain. Tell me, which episode from Russian history does it remind you of? When a comet, well, meant some terrible event in the history. When the people were very frightened, very nervous, and were expecting something bad to happen. When did it happen in Russian history? 812. 812, ага. Ну, вспомните хотя бы, если не «Войну и мир», то хотя бы фильм Бондарчука. The comet appeared in the sky in 1812 in Russia, and it was taken as a prediction, предсказание of the war with Napoleon. And a comet, which you can just see here in the picture, appeared in the sky in 1066. Well, driving people almost mad with fright and making them expect for something terrible to happen. So when Edward the Confessor was dying, was on his deathbed, 4 claimants or pretendants to British throne appeared. One of them was the King of Norway. As you remember, at the time Britain was part of Scandinavian Empire. So the King of Norway was claiming for to the throne. To claim to the throne is претендовать на трон. That was one of the pretenders. The other 2 were Edward's wife's brothers, that is his brothers-in-law, whose names were Tostig and Harold Godwinson. Both names are in the list. There was a 4th pretender, but I'll speak about him just a little later. In the same 1066, it was a hard year for Britain, a terrible battle happened at Stamford Bridge, Stamfordского моста, where both Tostig, one of the pretenders, and the King of Norway, the other pretender, were killed. Прошу меня простить, но как в детской сказке, волки от испуга скушали друг друга. And the 3rd pretendant, the one who was left, Harold the Godwinson, became the King of England. he went very quickly to Westminster Abbey and was crowned there. He was called Harold II, because you remember Harold the First was Canute's son, Harold the Harefoot. He was called Harold II Godwinson. Nobody knows whether he was a good king or a bad one. Some English people thought that he had all the he had everything to become an ideal king. But he didn't stay on the throne for more than several months, because in 1066 the fourth pretendant to the British throne appeared, and that was at that time Duke of Normandy. Duke of Normandy by the name of William, and the nickname, прозвище, the Bastard. What's a bastard? Bastard, незаконно рожденный. So William, who we know as Conqueror, had another nickname that was Bastard. He was the son of the Duke of Normandy, whose name was Robert the Devil. Помните, есть опера «Роберт Дьявол». Вот речь идет именно о нем. He was the illegitimate son of Robert the Devil, and his wife, his mistress, whose name was Arlette. Ну, как я понимаю, героиня той же оперы. His rights to the throne were no weaker than Harold Godwinson's, because William, Duke of Normandy, was the nephew of Edward the Confessor. What's a nephew? Племянник. So his rights, remembering that Edward the Confessor was not married and left no children, his rights were rather strong ones. So on the 28th of September 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, landed in Britain. And 2 weeks later, that is he landed on the 28th of September. On the 14th of October, the Battle of Hastings took place. Just a minute. Here is a picture that I would like first to make some comments on, and then show you, because it's rather small. There is a very important historical evidence, we can't call it a monument, скорее свидетельство, чем памятник, which is called the Tapestry of Bayeux. Слышали когда-нибудь? I'll write it on the blackboard. Just a minute. The tapestry, strictly speaking, means гобелен. Tapestry. Если когда-то кому-то из вас, да, вот представьте себе исторический памятник, придется водить экскурсии по Эрмитажу или еще где-то, не забудьте. Tapestry, гобелен. Tapestry of Bayeux. Looking at the name, it's clear that this place is in France. And this tapestry is, strictly speaking, not a tapestry at all, it's an embroidery. На самом деле это вышивка. Shall I write it down, just in case? Embroidery. To embroider, вышивать, embroidery, вышивка. And it is said to be made or to be embroidered by William the Conqueror's wife, whose name was Matilda. I'm not sure now, but it seems to me that this tapestry of Bayeux was about 20 or 24 meters long. Just imagine that. So it could cover the walls of this classroom all around. And rather wide, about 60 centimeters wide. It consists of dozens of different scenes showing different episodes of British history of the 11th century. For example, the pictures which I asked you to have a look at, beginning with Edward the Confessor on page 70. Have a look at it. The picture of Westminster Abbey. Then the sickness and death of Edward the Confessor on page 62. The funeral of Edward the Confessor. The comet of 1066. And the pictures of the Battle of Hastings. They are all taken from the tapestry of Bayeux. If I'm not mistaken, I think I can show you the colors of this tapestry. Just a minute. Так. Ага, вот. These are more or less the original colors. So you see nothing very bright, no red, no blue, but the colors are rather dull, rather crude. Цвета грубоватые, без изысков, но помните, что тогда вот секрет получения синей краски синили, вот это растение wood уже был утрачен, а индиго еще не привезли. So that's what the tapestry looks like. Tapestry in Bayeux. It was embroidered by William the Conqueror's wife Matilda for the bishop of Bayeux of that time, whose name was Odo, to decorate his cathedral. Now it is, well, I'm not sure where it is held, I think somewhere in France, but every textbook about English history refers to that tapestry. Делает ссылку обязательно на этот гобелен, который на самом деле вышивка. If you are interested, you can come and have a closer look. And here is a whole passage about the tapestry of Bayeux. If any of you is interested, you can read it during the break. Here is the landing, yes, the landing of William, Duke of Normandy, in Britain. Here you can see the horses being brought down from the ship to the land, because he brought cavalry with him. Here is the scene, the episode of the death of Harold. I think all of you remember that Harold was killed in the Battle of Hastings. And here are different episodes from the Battle of Hastings. By the way, two figures on this picture, on the middle one, are identified with Harold, and it is said by the scientists that one of them is Harold at the moment when he is trying to pull an arrow from his eye because he was wounded in the eye, and the second is showing him already falling to the ground and being also struck by the knight, by the Norman knight. So those of you who wrote in their quizzes that at Hastings the Saxons were fighting against the Normans were quite right. Those who wrote that the British were not right, because it's only at the time of the Trafalgar, that is, well, a little earlier than the Trafalgar, but much later than Hastings, all the people living on the British Isles became British. Here they were just Saxons, and the English, that's a mixture of Norman and Saxons, including Danes, Celts, Iberians, Beaker folk, and all the rest. So here it is. Have a look at it. Well, I won't tell you in many details about the Battle of Hastings, because a very detailed account of it is in Bell's book, and also there is a very nice book, very useful one, by a Russian author whose name is Zaitseva. I don't remember her name, and it is mentioned in the list of sources, which is there. Вот там есть два списка. Список использованных мною научных источников и список литературы, вот, рекомендованный мною для лучшего понимания истории Англии этого периода. Если кто-то заинтересуется, подойдите, посмотрите. Готов буду ответить на любые вопросы. So in Zaitseva's book, it is called Early Britain, and it covers the period from ancient Britain up to the 14th century. There is a very detailed description of the Battle of Hastings. I can only tell you that Harold's army was much smaller from the start. He was a worse tactic than William the Conqueror, or William, Duke of Normandy, so far, пока еще. Harold used the typical Saxon tactics. He made a strong palisade. Как же это называется? Ну вот такой лагерь, окруженный чистоколом. And from there, his archers, лучники, were shooting at the Normans. But the Normans made a nasty trick. They pretended, сделали вид, that they are retreating, что отступают. They managed to call the Saxons out of their palisade, and when the Saxons were not protected by the walls anymore, they were killing the Saxons by dozens on the hills of Hastings. Harold Godwinson was killed, the arrow went through his eye, and of course that means through his brain. So the wound into the eye is a mortal one, of course. And so William, Duke of Normandy, William the Bastard, became William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of Britain. And you should remember that Harold Godwinson was the last, after Edward the Confessor, the last English king ruling England. Then there were Norman kings, French kings, even Scottish kings. Remember the Stuarts. They were Hanoverians, that is German kings. So it's a very long time since England was ruled by an English person. Вот эту вот идею и советую вам очень хорошо запомнить, что, собственно, многие века Англией не управляли англичане. Ну, собственно, как и в нашей истории. Вспомните, сколько иностранных по происхождению правителей правило Россией. Так или иначе, входя в семью Романовых, но входя в основном посредством брака, не будучи по происхождению русскими. The same situation was in England. We shall talk about the Norman kings of Britain at the next lecture. I only want to ask you, now we'll have a break. This break will last for 20 minutes, as we had a whole lecture. We started a little earlier, начинаем пораньше, now it's 5 to 12, is that right? I would like you, that is all of you, to be here at 12:15, because we have a lot of kings to discuss and a lot of events to talk about. During our last lecture, 12:15. Thanks. Тем больше материалов. Поэтому, если вас заинтересует то, что вот было раньше, то вы сможете уже самостоятельно заниматься дальнейшей историей. После этой пары, которая должна кончиться без 22, да? После этого у вас будет, ну вот где-то там мы кончим, может быть, без четверти, у вас будет небольшой перерыв, минут 10, и потом придет Елена Юрьевна и покажет вам и мне кусочек фильма «Лев зимой», Lion at Winter, где главным персонажем является Генрих II, про которого мы нынче говорить будем. Генрих II и его 4 сына. It's our 5th lecture. Today I'll deliver the 5th and I think the beginning of the 6th lecture. The general title is Norman Conquest of Britain, and the subtitle is, well, it will give you the general idea, my idea of British history of that period. I think that history of Britain more and more is becoming the history of kings and queens. So more and more depends upon the personal character of the monarch of England or Britain. I would like you very quickly to have a look at the second passage in this text. The first about Edward the Confessor, well, if you are interested, you can find a minute and read it. But the last part, but one fact, is very, very close to the truth. Will you, please? Прошу прощения. Well, as I told you, after the death of William the Confessor and the death on the battlefield of Harold II, Harold Godwinson, Britain was ruled by anybody but the English, to say nothing about the Saxons. The first country to send the rulers to Britain was France. As to the Normans, I've used this word many times, and I think you have heard it if you read Ivanhoe by Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, pardon. You know this word too, the Saxons and the Normans. The Normans came to Britain led by William the Conqueror from Normandy, that is the northern part of France. And the similarity, сходство, between the words Normans and Northmen or Norsemen, whom we also call the Vikings, is not an accidental one. Strictly speaking, the ancestors, предки, of the Normans were also of the Danish origin. They came to Normandy from Scandinavia. They were the same kind of northern pirates, the same as invaded Britain in the 9th and 10th centuries. So the difference between the Normans and the Saxons in appearance or in character was not so great, but the political difference, of course, was existing from the start, as the Normans were the nation of the conquerors, the Saxons were the defeated nation, the nation of the subjects, подданных. After the victory at Hastings, William the Conqueror didn't have a quiet life because there were always revolts in different parts of the country. Harold's widow was revolting against William the Conqueror. The archbishops of Canterbury and of York, being Saxons by birth, were not very friendly to him. A person named Edward the Confessor's other nephew, was also the head of revolts. So it took William the Conqueror 20 years to suppress all the national resistance in Britain. And the first town he had to take by force was London. It's not a very long way from Hastings to London, even on foot or on horse. So soon after the Battle of Hastings, on the 14th of October, William the Conqueror came to the walls of London. The gates were closed and the citizens refused to surrender. Отказались сдаться. But William, he cut off all their communications. He devastated. It's a word from the list of words that I gave to you, vocabulary for lecture 5. To devastate, опустошить. He devastated the lands around London. He cut London off. The other territories, so under the threat of starvation, голод, at last the city surrendered to William the Conqueror. He entered London shortly after Christmas, and on the Christmas day, that is on the 25th of December 1066, he was crowned at Westminster as the King of England. As you remember, the archbishops of York and Canterbury were against William, but the Archbishop of Westminster somehow crowned him. So for 20 years, William was coming and going to and from his capital, destroying villages, burning crops, devastating miles and miles, square miles of land, suppressing the revolts in different parts of his country. From the very beginning, William the Conqueror showed the English people, made them sure that for him England was only part of his land. England was a part of his state of Normandy. But unlike many of his predecessors, unlike many other invaders, William was trying not to divide England into many parts, but to unite it and strengthen it, which was rather wise of him. When he won the battle at Hastings and became the English king, he was about 40. He was a very impressive figure, rather tall, rather fat, very strong, with reddish hair. So much we know about him. As to his character, he can be described as violent, domineering, and at the same time calculating. The words used that I'll be using for description of monarchs' characters are all here. Let us have a look at this list. Let's look through that. Please tell me which words are difficult for you, which are unfamiliar. You know, violent. Яростный. Domineering. Domineering. Ну, навязывающий свою волю, вот, сильная личность, одним словом, from to dominate. Ruthless, безжалостный, a synonym of merciless. Hot-tempered, ну, вспыльчивый, thanks, вспыльчивый с таким неуравновешенным, трудноконтролируемым характером. Rude, грубый. It is not about William the Conqueror, it concerns the other kings. Abominable, отвратительный. Calculating, расчетливый. Power-loving, I think that's clear. Властолюбивый. Strong-willed, сильной волей. Arrogant, высокомерный. Autocratic, the word is taken to Russian. Ну, как это у нас называется, авторитарный. Опять-таки, склонный навязывать вот свою волю одиночке всем остальным. Energetic, that's clear. Intelligent, intelligent and intellectual. Here, almost as synonyms. Only intellectual can also be used in a noun. He is an intellectual. He was an intelligent man. And as to innocent, guilty, these are not descriptions of character. We shall talk about the courts. Будем говорить про суды, про закон. So innocent, невинный, guilty, виновный. Well, so much. And now that I'll be talking so much about kings, I would like you just to keep in front of your eyes not only the list of names with all the wives and children, but also the chronology, the family tree of Norman kings and Plantagenets. We shall talk about them a little later. Well, as I told you, William the Conqueror was a domineering, sometimes cruel, sometimes violent, but a wise and calculating man. He was a typical strong arm. And as I told you, he was not dividing England, but trying to strengthen it. At the same time, he was the Duke of Normandy. So, when his first son was born, what was the name of his first son, according to the list or to the family tree? Sorry, excuse me, first was Robert. Слева направо по порядку рождения. Robert. Robert was made the Duke of Normandy. So when you have some lands in Normandy and in England, you make your elder son the inheritor of Norman lands. Then there were William, Henry, and two girls, Edith Matilda and Adela. There will be three Matildas. The most important of them is one line later, строчкой ниже. As to these two Matildas, Matilda of Flanders, the wife of William the Conqueror, is famous because of the Bayeux tapestry. Remember, it was she who embroidered that. As to Edith Matilda, she's not very important as a historical character. You can just remember that William the Conqueror, being a bastard himself, being an illegitimate child, was a very devoted husband, преданный муж, and is said to be a good father. So he had 5 children. Well, sometimes it happens. Speaking about the Normans and the English, or better, the Normans and the Saxons, one of the first things that the Norman did was to introduce, or to establish, so-called law of Englishry. Ну, как бы закон о принадлежности к английскому народу. The idea was the following. If a corpse, a dead body, was found, at first it was presumed, that it was a Norman. That it was a Norman killed by the English. If only it could be proved that the dead body belonged to a Saxon, then, well, the problems were over. It was only the problem of the closest relative. But if it was impossible to prove that the corpse found in the forest on the road somewhere belonged to a Norman, then the village nearest to the place was heavily fined. Деревню очень основательно штрафовали. Just for the fact of a dead body found there. That was called the law of Englishry. Закон о принадлежности вот к английской нации. From the very start, though, as I told you, there was not much difference between the Normans and the Saxons, they were of the same Germanic origin. They both partly came from Scandinavia. From the very start, the Normans were the conquering nation, the Saxons were the defeated nation. During these ages, the ages of the Norman Britain, of course, there was a lot of intermarrying. Well, как бы сказать, перекрестных браков. There was a lot of Normans marrying the Saxons and vice versa, and gradually the Normans assimilated as all the invaders before them did, just as the Danes, the Celts and others. They assimilated step by step, but this division between the noble race, благородная раса, and the lower race, that is the Saxons, existed for a long time. Do you remember the situation in Ivanhoe? Помните, да, Седрик хочет выдать воспитанницу Равенну за Ательстана, который и умом не блещет, и, в общем, Равенну особенно не привлекает, но у него одно неоспоримое достоинство – он сакс. Вот поэтому Седрик упирается изо всех сил. Хотя ни Равен, ни Ательстан Равенне особенно не нужны. Так вот, с точки зрения политической, гораздо более мудрым был бы брак Равена не с Айвенго, который тоже сакс, а с де Браси. С норманном, достаточно богатым, достаточно влиятельным. Вот это был бы брак, который на самом деле был бы полезнее для обоих наций. Он укрепил бы связь между побежденными и победителями. И постепенно вот браки такого рода помогли бы сгладить эту границу. But as you remember, Cedric, as many Saxon thanes, Cedric is a thane, Tan. He was awfully stubborn, so he insisted on Ravenna marrying a Saxon, which was not wise politically. One more thing that should be said about William the Conqueror is that he ordered the first, just a minute, he ordered the first перепись населения to be organized. He wanted to know for sure how many subjects he had, сколько подданных, which were their possessions, чем они владели, and what part of his subjects' possessions he could count on. So he sent officials to every part of his country, that is of Britain, and these officials began to make these lists. Вот, собственно, первая перепись населения в Англии и вообще одна из первых зарегистрированных в Европе. They were coming to villages, asking lots of questions. Of course, the people were not very glad to answer these questions. There were lots of conflicts. For example, well, when there was a girl in the family, the parents should pay the tax for her. So sometimes the girl were married rather soon so that the husband paid for her. Sometimes the parents didn't want to give away their daughters, but had to because they couldn't pay for 2 or 3 girls. The people were not very glad of all this questioning, but still the information that these officials gathered was organized and put into so-called Doomsday Book. Have you ever seen this name? Книга страшного суда. Вот ошибочное представление, что это что-то вроде апокалипсиса. Ничего подобного. Имелось в виду, что вот все, чем люди владеют, включая и землю, и деньги, и вассалов, все это, ну вот на все вопросы они должны отвечать чистую правду, и все сведения, собранные в этой книге, также правдивы и также не поддаются искажениям, как то, что вскроется в день страшного суда, когда море отдаст своих мертвых, земля отдаст своих мертвых, и как бы все их деяния будут перед глазами Бога. Несколько самонадеянно, в общем-то, со стороны Уильяма I рассчитывать на такую откровенность своих подданных. But the book was called Doomsday Book. Shall I write it down? Okay. Doom – проклятие, Doomsday – вот этот вот день страшного суда, Doomsday Book. And the date usually associated with it, the date when the book was completed is 1086. 1086. I can show you a very small, picture of this book as most of such historical evidences. It is kept in the British Museum. Here it is. A very thick one with lots and lots of information. And the central idea of this book is that whatever belongs, принадлежит to a person, well, lower, пожалуйста, to a person lower in the social staircase, whatever belongs to him belongs also to his master. Well, you know, in a short form, this idea can be expressed like my vassals. Vassal is my vassal. Вассал моего вассала – это мой вассал. И корова вассала моего вассала – это в сущности тоже моя корова. So, as it is said in the book 1066, the idea of Doomsday Book was that everybody and everything belonged to everybody else, and everything belonged to the king. Well, roughly, so приблизительно так. So, according to the Doomsday Book, the population of Britain in 1086 was about 2 million people. We can rely on this information because these are facts collected and written down. Remember, I told you once that by some source in 15th centuries BC, the population of Britain was estimated as 1 million. Nobody knows why. This information is much more reliable. So in the 11th century, Britain was rather thickly populated, but still it was less than half of St. Petersburg, 2 million people, including the Saxons, the Normans, and others. Just as we were talking about Anglo-Saxon mode of life or way of life, we shall talk a little about the new European way of life that the Normans brought with them. There are two possible opinions, there are 2 points of view on the role that William the Conqueror and his army and the people coming with him played in British history. Some people, some scientists, think that they were cruel and violent invaders, that they invaded the country, they were ruining villages, devastating the lands, that they killed the true English king, Harold II. But there is another point of view, that we, well, the British or we, should be grateful to William the Conqueror because he connected the British Isles to Europe. He made this country part of Europe and put an end to the barbarous life of Anglo-Saxon Britain. These are the 2 points of view. It's up to you which to support. I think in each of them there are some true things and some false things. There is a very nice book published, I think, about a year ago. I'm awfully sorry I didn't bring it today with me. The author is Борисова Л.М., если не ошибаюсь. And the book is called The History and the Mystery of English Words. It is mentioned in the list. Как бы тайны и истории английских слов. It consists, just that. Will you have a look? Great. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it to you. Can I show it to everybody? Thank you very much. Thanks. That's a colleague. I highly recommend it to you. I know that it is still in sale, все еще продается, and it is astonishingly cheap. It consists of several chapters combining historical passages with different stories concerning some words in English. For example, the fact that whiskey means water of life is taken from this book. There is a very nice passage which is called, just a minute, which is called Thanks to William the Conqueror. Here it is. Have you read it? Good. And it is about the kinds of food, the spices, spezie, the recipes, рецепты that the French brought to Britain. And for example, there is an interesting fact that the names for cattle were Anglo-Saxon, of Anglo-Saxon origin. That is such words as cow, ox, swine or pig, who else? Sheep. They are Saxon. These were the words used by the Saxon peasants. They were taking care of this cattle, they were growing this cattle. But whenever this cattle was brought to Norman castles, the animals turned to meat. And the meat names were Norman or French by origin. So such words as veal, помните, да, телятина, beef, говядина, pork, свинина, mutton, баранина, they are all of Norman origin. So as it is said in the book, it was the poor Saxon peasants who took care of the cattle and arrogant Norman barons who ate the meat, calling it by their own names. Thank you very much. So I recommend this book to you because lots of nice details concerning English language are here. And I think that slightly adapted by your own hand, some texts can be used even in the, with the little kids. Maybe not in the first form, but in the second or in the third. Some adaptation will be necessary, but the book is just great. Thank you very much. Will you give it back? So speaking of the Norman way of life, I can say that the Anglo-Saxon village, the plan of which I've already shown to you, has greatly changed in the Norman times. Have a look at it once again. Do you remember the picture? This is a typical Anglo-Saxon village with its 2 or 3 fields system, with the pasture, the meadow, the waste, the woods, the hedges, вот эти вот живые изгороди, the hedges surrounding the village. Here are the houses, here is the mill. And now will you have a look at this one? Approximately it's the same picture, isn't it? It's the same village, more or less, in the Norman times. That is, the difference is, 2 or 3 centuries. I can't show, I can't point with my finger, I think you are looking at it closely. The houses of the peasants are on the same place, more or less. The road is still crossing the village, being the only connection of this village with the rest of the world. But where it was the waste, there is the Norman castle and the church. Because usually the Normans were supporting the church, and the village priest was usually a welcomed guest at the Norman baron's castle. The mill is not belonging to one of the peasants anymore. The mill belongs to the Norman baron, and to have your grain to have your grain milled, you should pay a tax. You should also pay a tax to cross the bridge across the river, because the river also belongs to the Norman. The same system of fields stripped into different strips of land, it still exists, but most of these strips of land belong to the Norman. So all the peasants are working 4 or 5 or 6 days for their master, and only 1 or 2 days for themselves. And if you remember that it's forbidden to work on Sunday, then there's not much time left. Well, what else is the difference? I think it is rather, these 2 pictures are rather eloquent, достаточно красноречивые. That's why I would like, I would like first to show them to the girls here. Will you then pass them on? Will you each pair have a look at both pictures at the same time, comparing? I think it will do you more good than me talking and describing this difference in words. It's better to see once than to hear many times. Speaking about Norman castles, if you are interested, you will find quite a good description in any of Walter Scott's novels. There is a book mentioned there in the list by our competitor, соотечественницы, whose name is not a very beautiful one, Zinaida Shishova. She was writing at the beginning of our century, and her novel Jack Salomenko is one of my favorite historical novels. It describes the period of Wat Tyler's revolt, восстание Вотта Тайлера. That's the end of the 14th century. But some details concerning the Norman village, the Norman castle, they were not changing so quickly. So, for example, the description of trial by ordeal, описание суда Божьего, the description of the feast in the castle can all be found there. I highly recommend this book to you. Well, I'm sorry that I couldn't bring here a very beautiful album from the British Council Library dedicated to castles in Britain. Dozens and dozens of different castles with plans of them. Well, just couldn't do it. I'm leaving it to you, but I would like to show you some pictures. This is a picture of a feast, pir, not just a dinner, in a Norman castle. This is the table for the nobles, where the Norman, his wife, and his closest friends are sitting. And these are the tables for, most of all, for his bodyguards. Для охраны, for the servants. The closer you sit to the main table, the higher is your rank. As you see, the dogs are also in the room, in the hall. The floor is covered with straw. The coat of arms of the master is hanging above the table, and the furniture is rather crude. Мебель достаточно грубая. The same with the dishes. Will you have it? I think we'll do it in the same way. Ой, прошу прощения. Awfully sorry. Here is a picture of a kitchen. This is a reconstruction of a kitchen in the Norman castle. Usually the kitchens were in the ground floor, on the ground floor, or even lower, but usually on the ground floor. Well, here it is. Here are some dishes or pots and pans used at that time, and that's the way that the Normans were cooking their food. I think we'll start here now. Quite recently I found a picture which seemed rather interesting and funny for me, because the Normans were quite fond of good cooking. So cooks, especially chief cooks, ну что-то вроде шеф-повара, were quite popular people and could be even not exactly noble, but well, very respected people. Here is the just a minute. The effigy. Effigy, ну вот надгробное изображение. The effigy on the tomb, or grave, of a Norman chief cook. He even has a coat of arms with 3 cooking pots on it. Да, вот не львы, не леопарды, а 3 таких готовочных полукастрюли, полугоршочка. So as you see, the Normans estimated their cooks rather high. Here it is. Well, it was at that time, that is at the end of 11th century, that the Tower of London was begun. The White Tower was put up at that time. The Windsor Castle was also founded. And the Norman castles I was telling you about, at first they were just fortresses. Usually it was a strong tower built on a hill surrounded by a moat. Moat or ditch. Но обычно вот ров, окружающий замок, уже называется moat. They were usually drawbridges, that is, подъемные мосты. And all this made it very difficult to take the tower. The moat, the drawbridge, the steep hill, and of course the archers, лучники, shooting at you from narrow windows. But gradually the Norman castles, well, a Norman castle used as a fortress is shown in bells. Here it is. A typical Norman castle of the earlier period, when the most important thing for the Norman was to protect himself and his family. Here it is. But later, and the pictures that you are looking at now are of a later period, these fortresses became just dwelling places, просто жилища. So usually on the ground floor there were the kitchens, the hall, which can be called the banqueting hall, or the banquet hall, and on the second floor there were the bedrooms, which were usually called chambers. It's an older word for room, chamber. By the way, coming from French chambre, комната. There were so-called wardrobes. То есть, какие комнаты? Wardrobes. Гардеробные. Where dresses and costumes of generation after generation of Norman nobles were kept. And of course, in every castle, besides the kitchen, the stables, конюшни, the different larders or storerooms, складовые, there was a prison, that is, cells, for rebellious peasants, or just like in Ivanhoe, for a rebellious neighbor, for an unpleasant neighbor, where you can keep your neighbor, torture him, if these are your tastes, and wait for the ransom, ждать выкупа. At the Norman times, there were also church building was also gathering speed in Britain. The style of sorry, will you please be just a little quiet, okay? I don't mind you talking, but a little quieter. The style that the Normans used in their castle was called Romanesque, with a French ending of esque, Romanский стиль. It was before the Gothic. Which examples of Gothic style do you remember? Ну вот соборы в готическом стиле. Что? Погромче. Ну вот Тауэр не совсем. Он несколько на грани стилей. Ну а соборы? Ну собор в Солсбери, скажем. Да в сущности Вестминстерское аббатство тоже несет в себе какие-то черты готического стиля. But the style over the 11th, the 12th, maybe the 13th century was called Romanesque. And I can show you just an arch door. Такую вот дверь с аркой in this style. Here it is, with elaborate carving. С очень таким изощренным и тонкой резьбой по дереву. Простите, по камню. With rounded arches, да, с округленными сводами, в отличие от вот этих острых, таких несколько на иглы похожих очертаний готических соборов. This is Romanesque style. Here is one more example of the same style. This is not a very good photocopy of some Norman cathedrals founded in the 11th or 12th century. Will you have a look at them? A lot can be said about the new way of life brought by the Normans to England, to Anglo-Saxon England, and changing it forever. But if you read one of the books dedicated to this period, for example, Ivanhoe, well, you learn much more from these books than from all my talking here. And now we should talk a little more about politics. Just a year later, the making of Domesday Book, that is in 1087, William the Conqueror died. By the way, he died in France, on the continent. It happened to several English kings, the kings of England, that is, they died in France. His heir, наследник, was his first and eldest son, William II, who had a nickname, прозвище, William Rufus. латинское Rufus. Usually it is said that it was because of his red hair, but it is also mentioned that he had florid complexion, and you remember complexion, that is цвет лица, отнюдь не комплекция, да, вот как хочется сказать, такой ложный друг переводчика. So William II was red in face and had red hair. That's why he was called Rufus, Вильгельм рыжий. If you look at the family tree of William, you will see that he was the first pretender to the throne. As to his character, he was a nasty man. He was very rude, very hot-tempered. He was rude to his advisors and to his family. He was very cruel with people who broke his laws, especially the laws he made about the forests. It was in his time that whole villages were just ruined to include the land these villages stood on into so-called royal forests. William II was a passionate lover of hunting, so he turned about 1/3 of England into forests. They were called royal forests. Nobody but the king and his people could hunt there, and even those who were gathering twigs, sticks for the fire, were cruelly punished. And if a peasant, especially a Saxon, was caught hunting deer or even rabbits, he was blinded, while heads and legs were cut off, so people were mutilated. That is not executed, не казнили, но вот уродовали. And the first punishment was blinding people, ослепляли. Well, William was liked by neither, or as they say now, neither his court nor his subjects. He was very rude to the Archbishop of Canterbury of the time by the name of Anselm. And also William II is said to be homosexual, which of course didn't make him more popular in the eyes of his subjects. So when in just a minute, don't remember the exact date, yes, when in August of 1100, the date is easy to remember, isn't it? 1100. In August of 1100, he was shot by an arrow in the forest. He was shot into the back. So somebody shot from behind. None of the company he was hunting with stopped to help him. He was just left in the forest, bleeding and dying. And strange as it is, not his courtiers, не придворные, but just the peasants living not far from this forest, put him on a cart and brought him to the nearest city, nearest town, where he died. He was buried under so-called William stone. The picture of it is also in Bell. Just a minute. That is... Here it is. There is a whole chapter about the forest in Norman times, describing the laws. That is 88. Describing the laws about the forests, giving some pictures, for example, of a wild boar. Remember, Alfred the Great was compared to a wild boar when he was fighting the Danes, with a very sad picture of a hunter shooting a man instead of a rabbit by accident. And exactly this way, I think William II was shot. Maybe it was done on purpose. Maybe it was one of his brother Henry's friends. Here is so-called Rufus stone, or Rufus stone, under which he was buried. A cathedral, a newly built cathedral, was begun to be built on his grave, and it is said that the main tower of this cathedral crashed and fell to the ground. So the people took it as a sign that William, being abominable to all his people, was also abominable to God. That is, the cathedral couldn't stand on his grave. Henry I learned very quickly about his brother's death. He learned about it sooner than his brother Robert. Do you remember Robert, who was the Duke of Normandy at that time? So Henry hurriedly went to Canterbury and was there crowned by the Archbishop. Though Robert was the first pretender to the throne. Later Robert came to England but was defeated in a battle with his brother Henry. Henry, the second son of William the Conqueror, Henry I. He got a nickname, прозвище Beauclerc. Yes, Beauclerc, from the word clerk. То есть тот, кто хорошо пишет и хорошо читает. And why it was so, I'll tell you a little later. He resembled his father very much. He was also very strong-willed and very power-loving. But unlike William Rufus, he was also cold-hearted, calculating, and very well-educated. So he read and wrote much better than most of the people of his time. That's why Beauclerc. Is his nickname in your list of names? Good. And also in the chronology. Well, his main purpose was to persuade England that the lawless days of his brother William had come to end. Lawless, беззаконные. So if William the Conqueror was a firm hand, then his son William Rufus was just a fist. Если Вильгельм Завоеватель была такая типичная твердая рука, его сын Вильгельм Руфус был просто тупой, тяжелый кулак. As to Henry, it was a firm hand, firm in both sense of words, with the feather, с пером, and with the scepter, и со скипетром. So he was always in control of his temper. I mean Henry I. He was polite when he needed to, he was charming when he needed to, and in contrast to William Rufus, he became rather popular with the British people. He asked back the Archbishop Anselm, who was so rudely turned out by William. Anselm was very popular among the common people, среди простых людей. And after that, Henry promised to the people that he will observe their rights. Собственно, он первый, кто пообещал соблюдать права человека, more or less. He tried to visit as many parts of his kingdom as he could, and well looked after his barons who were not so loyal as they could be. The barons were almost the main threat to every English king, but Henry managed to deal with them somehow. He took an English wife by the name of Matilda, again, but that was an unimportant Matilda. Это все еще не самая главная Матильда. You remember, it was just what Canute did, taking a Saxon wife. So Henry I's wife was also English. She was a great niece or something like that of Alfred the Great, a very far descendant of Alfred the Great. And by her, as they say, от нее, not from her, but by her, Henry I had a son, a boy of very many gifts, whom he had great hopes of. He also had a daughter, Matilda, and that's the important Matilda, but we shall talk about her a little later. Henry was doing his best to educate his son, whose name was William, as you see it here, William, Duke of Normandy, and who held great hopes of him, but by some sources in 1120, by others in 1119, the boy drowned on a ship which was called, I'll try to show you the picture of that ship, which was called White Ship. Well, here it is. If you are interested, you can come and have a look. All the crew, commander of the ship, drowned in a storm, including including Prince William, one person survived to tell Henry the terrible news. And as it is said in most English textbooks, after the death of his son, Henry never smiled again till his death. Well, so strong was his grief of a father and of a king who lost his heir to the throne. I'd like to show you a picture which I found quite recently. It's a medieval painting. По-моему, это гравюра. It is called Henry I's Nightmares. What's nightmare? Кошмар. So you will see it closer. You see, there are 3 pictures of Henry I sleeping. 1, 2, 3. And these are 3, well, how to put it, 3 groups of people, 3 groups of his subject who disturbed him very much. First are the revolting peasants, бунтующие крестьяне. The second of his problems were unloyal barons, неверные, склонные к предательству бароны. That is the Norman nobles. The third, as it is said, clamoring priests. Вот неспокойные, постоянно чего-то требующие священники. So as you see, he had a lot of reasons to be worried. These are the nightmares of Henry I. Of course, I pity him a lot, but I find the picture rather funny. Just imagine your own nightmares and frights depicted like this. Представьте, иногда попытайтесь в тяжелую минуту представить себя вот на такой картинке. Вот вы дремлете, и все ваши ужасные проблемы вот в таком изображенном виде сразу покажутся гораздо менее страшными. Well, Henry I died in 1835, and as you remember, as his natural heir died, his daughter Matilda had to inherit the throne. Matilda was married very early, at the age of 11 or 12, to the Emperor of Rome. Of course, it was just a political marriage, просто такой династический брак. She was only 12-year-old. I'm not even sure that she had seen her husband. But then, being much older than her, he died. And when Matilda was quite a big girl, about 20, she married Geoffrey of Anjou. That is a prince from one of French provinces, Anjou. Geoffrey had a nickname, Geoffrey the Handsome. Красавчик Geoffrey. This Geoffrey was very unpopular with Matilda's father, Henry I. I think it's a familiar situation when father-in-law doesn't like his son-in-law. Henry is said to have public quarrels with his wife's husband. So after his death, and of course Matilda was not very popular either. After Henry's death, Matilda claimed to the throne. But there were 2 reasons why she couldn't be admitted by Norman barons. First, she was a foreigner. She didn't live in England. She had a foreign husband. Her children were speaking French better than English. Second, she was a woman. Remember that the last woman really important in the history of England after Queen Boudica was the daughter of Alfred the Great, Ethelfleda, who was Our Lady of Mercia. That's something. So Matilda was deeply unpopular, and also being rather rude and arrogant, though quite beautiful, she was not good at making friends. She couldn't smile when it was necessary. She was very arrogant, высокомерная. So the barons, who had to decide who will be the king, preferred a person whose name was Stephen of Blois, the nephew of Henry I, the son of his sister Adela. Here he is, Stephen of Blois. This Stephen is the father, and here is Stephen, who ruled from 1135 to 1154. So there were 2 pretenders to the British throne at the same time, Matilda and Stephen, the daughter and the nephew. Stephen was very generous in promises. but usually he couldn't keep his promises. At first he was supported by most of the barons, but when it came to fulfilling his promises, he couldn't do that. So he lost part of his supporters. He was crowned at Westminster at about Christmas time in 1135, the same year Henry died. And soon after that, Matilda landed in Sussex in the head of an army of French people, traveled to Bristol, and after several victories entered London. But in London she always asked for money, and when the the elders, the most respected people of London came to her to talk to her and brought her a petition asking her, well, to lessen her demands, несколько уменьшить запросы, she swore at them. Она просто начала на них вот громко и начала бранью гнать их из комнаты. So naturally, Matilda didn't become a queen at all, and she was not popular in London. Rather soon she was driven out of London, and though she called herself a queen, officially she was not crowned. Then the civil war between Stephen and Matilda began. Was a civil war? Гражданская война. It was not the first and of course not the last civil war in British history. It lasted for 19 years. That is from the year when Stephen came to the throne, 1135, well, add 19. Both Stephen and Matilda were cruel and merciless when victorious, and rather desperate when defeated. Matilda was, as I told you, Matilda was too arrogant, too autocratic, and also a woman to be popular. Stephen did keep his promises. So the period of war between them was called by one of the monks writing a chronology of that period, the terrible 19 winters when God and his angels slept. It's a very famous quotation. Страшные 19 зим, когда Бог и его ангелы спали. You can just imagine what was happening in Britain during these 19 winters. At last, in 1148, Matilda returned to Normandy, her cause lost. Дело ее было проиграно. Stephen remained on English throne, but he had to agree that after his death, Matilda's son, Henry, would become the king. Stephen died in 1154, and then the son of Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou became Henry II. He also had a nickname, прозвище. It was, let me see, in French it is Courmantel. If pronounced in English way, Kurt Mantle, something like that, короткий камзол. He was a rather elegant man. I think it was he who put the short mantle in fashion. So, Kurt Mantle. Is his nickname mentioned here? Yes, it is in the family tree. He was married to Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, герцогиня Аквитанская. And I think if we look at English history, at the life of the kings, most of the wives were coming from abroad, from France, from Spain, sometimes from Austria. That is, very often English kings married the foreigners. Here is the map of so-called continental dominions of Henry II. Ну вот его доминионы, его территории на континенте. Here you are. He got Anjou from his father, Geoffrey of Anjou. Normandy was part of the kingdom since the time of William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy. He got Aquitaine as the dowry, наследство, приданное, sorry, of his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. And as to Brittany, well, it was always a territory rather closely connected with Britain. So these were the territories belonging to Henry II on the continent, to say nothing about the British Isles. Well, of course, the more land you have as a king, the more problems there are. First, Henry's romance with his wife was not a successful one, though he had 4 sons by her. And it is always mentioned in history that he was always quarreling with his wife, which is not surprising. He had a keen taste for women, for girls. He was always in love with somebody else, which of course she didn't like. And Eleanor, well, avenging him, как бы в отместку, was also directing her sons against their father. I'm afraid that it's a familiar situation when the parents are in a conflict and the children are taking side of one of them and are against the other. So Henry's sons were never in very good relations with him. Here you are. Henry II, personally, he seems to be quite an attractive man. First, it is said about him that his hands were always busy, either with a bow or with a book. То есть руки у него никогда не пустовали, он обязательно держал в них или лук, или книгу. He was a very energetic man, so he was discussing political questions walking, that is, pacing to and fro, like this. Just imagine how pleasant it is to speak to your king when he is not looking at you, but going to and fro. Even during the mass, во время мессы, he was fidgeting on his chair, так вот, шевелился всячески, ягозил. He was stamping his foot, переступал с ноги на ногу. He was in whisper, discussing important matters with his courtiers. But if only that made him unpopular with the church, that wouldn't be so terrible. Another thing to say about Henry II is that he was quite an educated man. He had always a taste for poetry, for philosophic and literary discussions. So when I was about 13, I read a play by a French author, Jean Anouilh, which is called Thomas Becket. I switched to Russian for a minute. И вот эта вот пьеса мне произвела огромное впечатление. Я долго-долго жила в убеждении, что Генрих тупой. Это вот такой вот, ну, не то чтобы тупой, но крайне вульгарный, самоуверенный, самонадеянный тип, не занятый ничем, кроме охоты за все новыми и новыми девушками и мерзкими препирательств с церковью. За это, конечно, спасибо Жану Ануилу, у него своя точка зрения. Симпатии Жана Ануилля всячески на стороне Томаса Беккета. Томас Беккет был одним из ближайших друзей Генриха II. Это был блестящий придворный, очень красивый, очень элегантный, очень молодой. Он в 40 лет стал лорд-канцлером Англии. Такого просто не бывало, чтобы в такие годы человек уже дослужился до такого поста. Он сопровождал Генриха во всех его делах и увеселениях, у него была очень крепкая голова. Так что, когда все его собутыльники уже лежали под столом, Беккет еще прекрасно соображал. Он пользовался огромным успехом у женщин. Он понимал кое-что в искусстве. Ну вот у Ануилля есть сцена, когда Беккет обучает нескольких нормандских баронов пользоваться вилкой. Они понимают его не совсем правильно, ему приходится сказать: бароны, вилки, они для еды, они для драки. Вот. И затем, вот по версии Ануилля, Генрих II исключительно из каприза, повздорив с архиепископом Ансельмом, назначает Беккета архиепископом Кентербери. Вещь неслыханная. Светского человека, вот такого вот придворного кутилу и гуляку, Беккет очень долго сопротивляется, но в конце концов соглашается. И вот, став архиепископом, он меняется неузнаваем. Во-первых, он ведет аскетический образ жизни. Во-вторых, он очень серьезно вникает во все дела церкви и начинает противостоять Генриху во всех его начинаниях. То есть вместо того, чтобы защищать интересы своего короля, он начинает защищать интересы церкви. Делает это Ну, вот так, как может это делать человек умный, образованный и с твердым характером. Так вот, симпатии Жана Ано на стороне Беккета, поэтому он создает несколько превратное представление о Генрихе. But after reading some more books, I understood that Henry was educated, intelligent, rather hot-tempered, that's true, but well, wise and rather attractive. So, of course, his quarrel with the church was not only a personal quarrel with Thomas Becket. Though when Becket opposed him and resisted him, he hated them even more, as before they were close friends. The problem with church was the following. Henry II was also a man who loved order. He tried to look after his judges, судьи, and to supervise his courts, суды. He insisted that a normal legal process at the court replaced the medieval trial by ordeal. And in his time, the normal legal procedure was slowly replacing the ordeal by fire, ordeal by water, Saxon trials, or Norman trial by weapons. I told you about that as well. So the jury system was established by Henry. Ну вот суд, в котором главную роль играют присяжные. И где все разбирательство основывается не на том, обожжет человек руку раскаленным железом или нет, а на фактах, на свидетельских показаниях. But the priests, that is the churchmen, violently opposed that. They didn't agree to be trialed, быть судимыми, just as common people. If a priest committed some crime, he could be judged only by higher priests. There was a process, a special procedure for that. If a priest was accused of some crime, no matter how serious, he was made to eat a piece of bread and cheese on the altar. Just to stand on the steps of the altar, he was given a piece of bread and cheese, and a prayer was made to Archangel Gabriel, Archangel Gabriel, to stop the priest's throat if he is guilty. If the man was not nervous, if he was enough, sure of himself enough, of course he swallowed the bread and cheese, проглатывал, and was presumed innocent. More than that, every educated person, literate person, грамотный, could escape punishment. To prove that you are innocent, you had to read several lines or passages from some text. The text was prescribed. Это был специальный предписанный текст, выбранный. Everybody knew. Well, those who cared to know, they knew. So many prisoners were learning these lines by heart with the help of their gaolers, с помощью тюремщиков. What you needed is just to give the gaoler some money, and he would teach you these several lines from the text. And whenever, as soon as you read these lines, as you prove that you are an educated man, that means that you are innocent. That was the way that Henry II encouraged education, поощрял образование. А вы так мучаетесь, когда я прошу прочесть маленький кусочек из текста. Представьте себе каждый раз, что от этого зависит, признают вас виновными или нет. So, the church people refused to come to normal courts. Henry II insisted that they, well, I'm afraid I can't find the good English word. Ну, в общем, чтобы священники были подотчетны, чтобы они подлежали обычной юрисдикции, чтобы они являлись светский суд. And the churchmen opposed that. So, when Thomas Becket became the Archbishop of Canterbury, he defended the positions of the church. Once a canon, канонник, that is quite a small church rank, a canon from Bedford, if I'm not mistaken, yes, excuse me, a canon from Bedford committed some crime. And though he killed somebody, though Becket was disgusted by the very act of killing, he refused to give away this priest to a normal legal court, to give away Будет. He was defending this canon of Bedford, which led to a serious quarrel between Henry II and Thomas Becket. Becket fled to France, escaped to France, and lived there for 6 years. He was living a very ascetic life, and the facts, the information coming from France back to England was all in his favor. So he was becoming more and more popular among the common people. So after these 6 years, Henry II had to call him back, to plead him, упрашивать почти, to come back, and in 1170 Becket returned. But in the meanwhile, тем временем, Henry II exiled all his friends and relatives, отправил ссылку, and appointed the Archbishop of York, made the Archbishop of York crown his son, which was unheardable, to have a son crowned when the king is still alive. There is a very famous print gravura showing Henry II serving his young son at table, обслуживая, подавая, по-моему, он изображен в тот момент, когда он подает своему сыну чашу с вином, showing that this is the king of Britain, and even he, the king of now, is serving his son. That was unheardable and unbearable. The Pope of Rome was indignant, возмутился. Of course, the Pope was supporting Becket, and when the Pope put a verdict on England, наложил вердикт, forbidding to celebrate the Mass, запретив слушать мессу, which was very important for religious people, Henry II understood that he had gone too far, что зашел несколько слишком далеко. He called Becket back, but soon a new quarrel broke up, and in 1170 or in 1171, it's not exactly clear, Henry was heard to say, when he was on the continent, a very famous sentence. In English it sounded like this: "What a parcel of fools and dastard have I nourished by my house. None of them will avenge me of this upstart priest." Ну что-то вроде, что за ораву дураков и что за ораву болванов и вот никчемных дармоедов я кормлю за своим столом. Ни один из них не может избавить меня от этого зазнавшегося попа. This quotation is a very famous one. So 4 knights, рыцари, took Henry II on his word, came to Canterbury and killed Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, on the very steps of the altar. It is said that when when the blow fell on his head, his brains were spilled on the very steps of the altar. То, что ступени алтаря были забрызганы. It didn't make Henry II any good, because to kill a person in church is a terrible crime. When it is a high church priest, it's even worse. 2 years later, Thomas Becket was canonized, был канонизирован. Since then, he became Saint Thomas Becket, известный нам как святой Фома Бекет, или Бекетский иногда. В русском варианте он известен как Фома. Well, Thomas Becket was canonized in 1173 as a martyr, как мученик, and rather soon, Henry II took a public, how to put it, he took a public penance, принес публичное покаяние. He was flogged by 70 monks of the monastery. What's to flog? Ну, высечь, отхлестать. That is, ritually, every day, Henry II, the king, was flogged by 70 monks in turn. That was his public penance. So the Pope forgave him, but still Thomas Becket is much more popular than Henry II, though it was Henry who defended the interests of the crown, and Becket was defending the interest of the church. So this quarrel between English monarch and English church started then and, well, never stopped for long. Even now you know that there are some problems with part of the English people being Protestants and part Catholic. But then England was still a Catholic country. One of you mentioned Geoffrey Chaucer when I asked about famous writers. So the most famous passage from Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, here it is. Here is the book. Is dedicated just to the pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Это знаменитое паломничество к гробнице Фомы Беккета или Томаса Беккета. This is the passage which almost all students of English, I mean English-speaking students, should know by heart. I think you know it. Shall I read it? It's a short one. Так, это общий пролог. Здесь начинается книга кентерберийских рассказов. Here is Geoffrey Chaucer. Supposed to be. Когда апрель обильными дождями разрыхлил землю, взрытую ростками, и мартовскую жажду утоля от корня до зеленого стебля набухли жилки той весенней силы, что в каждой роще почки распустила, а солнце юное в своем пути весь знак овна успело обойти, и ни на миг ночи не засыпая, без умолку звенели птичьи стаи, так сердце им встревожил зов весны. Тогда со всех концов родной страны паломников бесчетных вереницы мощам заморским снова поклониться стремились истово. Но многих влек Фома Бекет, святой, что им помог в беде или исцелил недуг старинный, сам смерть переняв, как мученик безвинный. Here it is. Случилось мне в ту пору завернуть в харчевню Таборт в Саурке, свой путь совершая в Кентербери по обету. Здесь ненароком повстречал я эту компанию, их 29 было, цель общая в пути объединила их дружбу, они, пример всем нам, шли поклониться праведным мощам. После чего каждый из 29 пилигримов рассказывает свою историю. Помните, да? Тот же принцип в организации книги, что использован в Декамероне, в Гептамероне Маргариты Наварской, в таких сборниках. So there's not much left to say about Henry II. His late years were not happy ones. He didn't become popular again after the death of Thomas Becket. He was in constant conflict with his wife, Eleanor, and he died in 1189 when and it is said that when he was dying, a list of rebels was shown to him, a list of persons revolting against him. It was when he saw his youngest son John's name in this list, he turned his face to the wall and said, "Enough, now let things go as they may. I don't care much about them or myself." That is, с меня хватит, пусть все идет как идет, а меня больше не волнуют ни дела страны, ни я сам. So, learning that his fourth son, not only the elder three, but the youngest, John, is in revolt against him, he turned his face to the wall and died. The last two people I'll tell you about today will be the ones whose pictures I've already shown to you. It's doubtful, вряд ли, that they could meet just like they are shown. They were not exactly of the same age, but here they are. Richard the Lionheart and John the Lackland. Both were the sons of Henry II. Usually only three of his sons are mentioned. His eldest, Henry, who went on a crusade earlier than Richard, отправился в crusade, крестовый поход. Usually his son Geoffrey is not mentioned. I don't know why. Strictly speaking, Geoffrey was the second pretendant to the throne. The most famous are Richard and John. As I've already told you, Richard, one of the most popular kings of England, John, the most unpopular one. No other kings by the name of John. Well, I'll try in the 5 or 7 minutes that are left, I'll try to show you that this point of view is not exactly, well, not correct, but just. То, чтобы неправильный, не совсем справедливый. When their father, Henry II, died, Henry, the eldest son, was on the continent far away in Palestine. Geoffrey, who was at the time together with his mother Eleanor on the continent in France, hurried to Britain, but Richard was the first. He got himself crowned and became Richard I. Officially, he was the king for 10 years, that is, being crowned in 1189. He remained King of England till 1199. But during all this time, he stayed in Britain for 4 months at most. Самое большее. He spent in Britain no more than 4 months. He was very busy. He was preparing for a crusade. Strictly speaking, though he was born in Oxford, one of the most English towns, he always considered himself French. His French was much better than his English. He was also, well, more fond of his mother than of his father. That is why he saw England not as his kingdom and not as his birthplace and native country, but just as the source of money to support him on the crusades. Of course, to organize the crusade, to equip, снарядить, экипировать himself and his knights took a lot of money. So he was ready to sell everything and everybody. He is believed to say that if there was a customer, he would sell London itself. Чтобы Лондон продал, если бы только нашелся покупатель. Getting enough money, he left England and went on a crusade. There he was fighting with the Muslim leader Saladin. And the musical that I highly recommend you by just a minute, by Tim Rice, the author of Words to Jesus Christ Superstar and other musicals, and another composer, not Andrew Lloyd Webber but Stephen Oliver. The musical is called Blondel. That's the name of Richard's friend and a musician. But strictly speaking, the musical just about Richard's departure from England, leaving it to John, Prince John at that time, and then his returning. In this musical, the sympathy of the author is divided between Richard and John, but his favorite character, of course, is Blondel. The legend about Blondel, I think I'll better tell it in Russian. Легенда вот об этом молодом человеке по имени Блондель такова. Он был министрелем и личным другом Ричарда. И вот считается, что когда Ричард после победоносного участия в крестовом походе по дороге домой был захвачен в плен герцогом Австрии в расчете на выкуп и с полгода томился в тюрьме, Блондель отправился на его поиски. И вот якобы он путешествовал по всем странам Европы и однажды как раз под окнами темницы Ричарда спел некую песню, посвященную Ричарду, на что Ричард откликнулся, и Блондель помог ему оттуда удрать. Ну, как всякая легенда, она несколько приукрашает события. Различные варианты есть этой легенды, но вот Тим Райс не был бы Тимом Райсом, если бы не повернул это все несколько по-своему. У него Блондель такой вот очень одаренный, но неудачливый с точки зрения, с точки зрения успеха в массах музыкант. И вот когда Ричард отплывает в свой поход, Блондель сочиняет песню, восхваляющую Ричарда, его крестоносцев, но Ричард так занят, сходя на корабль, что, взглянув на первую строчку, говорит: ах, ну да, очень мило, как хорошо, а вот это, пожалуйста, к моему брату Джону. Он теперь тут всем заправляет. И когда Ричард не возвращается обратно, Блондель отправляется по всей Европе, но его сопровождает трио, дающий ему такой бэк-вокал, трио девиц, которые называются Blondettes. И вот Блондель гоняется по всей Европе за Ричардом, а за Блонделем гоняется его возлюбленная Фиона, которая говорит ему, что в самом-то деле пора бы уже взяться за ум, остепениться и жениться на ней, вместо того, чтобы писать песенки, которые все равно никто не слушает. А вот за Блонделем, Ричардом и Фионой гоняется наемный убийца, посланный принцем Джоном, чтобы покончить с Ричардом. И вот так вот они таким победоносным турне проходят по всем странам Европы, Блондель везде поет свою песню. В конце концов добирается до Австрии и, совсем отчаявшись, так прикорнув на какой-то кочке под стенами тюрьмы, вот напевает про себя эту песенку. Высовывается Ричард и спрашивает: что это вы там делаете, кошку что ли душите? Я еще и это обязан слушать. На что Блондель говорит ему: «Sire, Блондель», после чего они обмениваются таким диалогом. Один из них говорит: «Sire, Блондель, you, I must escape. My country needs you, me». «Сир, вам надо бежать, моя страна нуждается в вас, во мне». И действительно бегут. Well, I would like to introduce you only to one episode from the musical, the episode of unsuccessful coronation of Prince John. He's trying to get the crown of England on his head as soon as possible. He is hurrying the Archbishop of Canterbury, торопит. But at the decisive moment, Richard appears and with the help of Blondel, well, takes the crown back. I think it's very unhistorical. But if you read Walter Scott or any other source, you will know that Prince John was really ruling England for a very long time during all Richard's absence, just as a king. So of course the idea of Richard's coming back and becoming the real ruler was not very dear to his heart. Before we listen to that extract, which will be the conclusion of this lecture and this course, I would like only to say a few words about Prince John, that after Richard's death in 1199, Richard died as he would dream to die, in a battle. He was shot by an arrow, and it is said about him that he ordered to leave alive the person who killed him, which was a characteristic gesture for Richard. But no less characteristically, one of his bodyguards, after the castle was captured, flayed the man alive. Ричард велел отпустить на свободу того, кто его застрелил. Один из его телохранителей живьем содрал с этого стрелка кожу. И то, и другое вполне характерно для эпохи. Well, after Richard's death, Prince John at last became the King of England, John the First, the last one. He was called the Lackland because he lost lots of land, though being greedy. Он был очень жадным, как считается. Ситуация, описанная в Айвенго, действительно имела место очень много раз. Он брал под опеку земли уехавших в крестовый поход и не хотел отдавать их по возвращении. Он требовал что-то вроде выкупа с отцов девушек, которые выходили замуж. То есть это то, что называется «he had a finger in every pie». Не говоря о том, что он без устали преследовал жен своих подданных, поскольку был большим ценителем женской красоты. Это он был влюблен в так называемую Розамунду Прекрасную, Rosamund the Beautiful, и любил ее так сильно, что заточил в башню, вот окруженную Вудстокским лабиринтом, куда никто кроме него пройти не мог, желая, чтобы никто не видел ее красоты, кроме него. За Розамундой Прекрасной последовали, естественно, многие другие, и причины недовольства его жены Эленор, в общем, можно понять. И правление его кончилось достаточно печально, когда в 1215 году бароны, недовольные этими бесконечными поборами, требованиями денег и земель, объединились и при посредстве тогдашнего архиепископа Стивена Лэнгдона вынудили короля, не то чтобы силой, но В общем, вынудили подписать так называемую Великую Хартию Вольностей, латинский вариант Magna Carta, английский это Great Charter, которая отнюдь не была вот такой демократической конституцией, какой ее иногда пытаются представить, она просто ограничивала королевский произвол в отношении баронов. Права баронов были немножко ею гарантированы, королевские чуть ограничены. Поэтому мы с вами сейчас посмотрим на, пожалуйста, на ту трактовку Великой Хартии Вольности, которую дают нам авторы книги 1066. Вот, а затем в качестве свидетелей поприсутствуем на торжестве справедливости, когда коронация принца Джона нарушается приездом короля Ричарда. Давайте из соображений экономии времени сделаем, как уже делали. Ага. На самом деле то, что делаю я, как бы делать не следует. Это в высшей степени неразумно брать на себя большую часть работы, когда ее должны выполнять учащиеся. Так и знаете. Итак, в это царствование, то есть царствование короля Джона, также случилось такое знаменательное событие, как Магна Карта, образованная от латинского «магна» – «великая» и «карта» – «хартия». Это была первая из знаменитых хартий в этом районе, то есть Британии, и изобретена она была баронами на уединенном острове на Темзе, называвшемся Ганимед. На самом деле остров назывался Раннимед. Собравшись там, вооруженные до зубов, бароны заставили Джона подписать Великую Хартию, которая гласила: никого нельзя приговаривать к смерти, если только на то нет какой-нибудь причины. Вышесказанное не относится к простым людям. Все должны быть свободны, кроме простых людей. Все должно быть одного веса и размера по всей Британии, кроме простых людей. Дело в том, что при Джоне было организовано что-то вроде палаты меры весов, то есть были установлены какие-то эталоны меры и веса. Так вот, все и вся должно быть одного веса и одного размера, кроме простых людей. Все суды должны находиться на одном месте и вовсе ни к чему следовать вот этому старому средневековому обычаю, известному как король собственной персоны по всей стране. То есть речь идет о том, что не обязательно королю каждый раз надзирать за судебной процедурой, личное там присутствие. Ни на кого нельзя налагать штрафы, ведущие к полному его разорению, не считая короля. Именно так они и делали. И в этом был корень проблемы Чарльза I, вот в его ссоре с парламентом. Баронов вообще нельзя судить, а судить их может только специальная группа присяжных, состоящая из других баронов, которые понимают их и относятся к ним с сочувствием. Итак, Магна Карта явилась главной причиной демократии в Англии и таким образом была хорошей вещью для всех, кроме простых людей. И поскольку королю Джону не на чем было стоять, как бы у него не было почвы под ногами, он получил прозвище Джон Лекшенкс. Шенкс, ну скажем, Джон Бесколенный, вместо безземельный. Вот. Ну вот, а сейчас я хотела бы вашему вниманию предложить вот этот вот маленький отрывок из мюзикла.